So what do you do when you're facing a circumstance and there's nothing you can do? There are some problems that you can solve, but there are some unsolvable problems. There are some tensions you can resolve, but there are some tensions that are just unresolvable. Sometimes you just get into a situation where it is what it is, and that's just the way it is. So as we begin this series, No Worries, I want to begin by asking you guys this question. What do you do when there's not much you can do? What do you do when you get the diagnosis from the doctor who says, well, we know what it is. It's not terminal, but it is chronic. We can treat you, but we can't cure you. And that's how it's going to be. What do you do when you're in your senior year of high school and back in your freshman year, your teachers or your parents said, these grades count, these grades count, these grades count, and now you're a senior and you suddenly realize, oh, those grades counted. But there's not much you can do. What do you do, parents, when your kids are leaving the nest and you see them making some choices and they're not wise choices, but they're their own people and they're autonomous now and you can't control their lives like you could when they were 5 years old? What do you do when there's not much you can do? What do you do when the economy goes bad and you can't do anything about it? Or maybe like right now where our national economy is pretty good, but maybe your personal economy is horrible and there's not much you can do about it. What do you do when you can't do much about your personal economy or about your job security? What do you do when there's not much you can do? That's a pretty easy question to answer, isn't it? Here's what we do. We worry. Now, all of us fall somewhere on a scale when it comes to worry. Some of you, you're so far out at one extreme, you don't just worry about your problems, you worry about all the problems that exist on the face of the planet, and you probably know someone like this. You just worry about everything. Everything is a huge worry and concern for you, and you don't like that it's that way. You would love to quiet your mind. You would love to be able to get a good night's sleep, but you're just worried about everything. Some of you, you're way on the other end of the spectrum where nothing bothers you, nothing worries you at all. In fact, you're probably married to someone on the other end of the spectrum, and they're worried that you're never worried. You know what I mean? They're mad at you because they think you don't care, and it's not that you don't care, and it's not that you're not concerned. You just don't worry about stuff. Now, if that's you, if you're way over there on that end of the spectrum, I'm just going to level with you right now. This series really doesn't apply to you. You can just chill out. But you're already doing that anyway. So someone can wake you up when we're done and they'll tell you it's time to go home. But I don't think that's too many of us. I think pretty much all of us are somewhere on that scale because pretty much everyone I know deals with worry. Now, the thing that really caught my attention as I was first sitting down and getting ready to study for the series, I didn't realize how many books and blogs and articles have been written dealing with the topic of how to deal with worry in our lives. And the reason why I discovered there's so many books on this is because people know that if they can write a book or an article that practically helps you deal with worry in your life, it's going to sell a lot of copies. Pharmaceutical companies know if they can manufacture a drug that will help people deal with worry, they will sell a lot of medication because worry is part of the human condition. And when you worry, you don't like it. In fact, worry comes with some pretty bad side effects. First of all, there's physical side effects of worry, such as distraction, nausea, elevated blood pressure, and inability to concentrate, headaches, muscle aches. If you deal with chronic worry, that can lead to ulcers, really high blood pressure, and even heart attacks. There's emotional ramifications of worry. If you worry a lot, you'll feel also the emotions of bitterness, resentment, and anger, because when you worry, it drains your emotional tank down to empty. And then when someone comes along and causes a new problem that you worry about, you get resentful or angry at them because you don't have the capacity to deal with it. Or when life comes along and gives you something else to worry about, you get angry at life/God because now there's more you have to worry about and you already don't have any emotional capacity to do that. So worry has emotional impact on our lives. Worry, today we're going to discover, even has a spiritual impact on our lives. Because worry, the nature of worry, erodes our capacity to have faith in God. Worry erodes our confidence and trust that God is who He says He is and that He will do everything that He has promised to do. So today and for the next 3 weeks, we're going to talk about worry. Now, here's why I think this series is worth the price of your attention. Worry is not new to the human condition. It has been part of the human condition for centuries and centuries. And Jesus, 2,000 years ago, better than perhaps anyone, understood what exactly it is that causes us to worry, and He understood better than anyone how to deal with worry at the root level. Not just deal with the symptoms of worry, take a deep breath, try and relax. No. He knew how to deal with the root causes of worry in our hearts and in our lives. And so what we're going to do is we're going to discover what Jesus taught about understanding what causes worry, and more importantly, how to deal with worry in our lives. And I think this is going to be helpful for everyone, which is why I'm really excited to get going with this series. Now, to get started today, we're going to be in one of the 4 biographies of the life of Jesus. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were 4 first-century men. They each wrote a biography of the life of Jesus. Today, we're going to be in Mark's Gospel in chapter 4, and I'll give you the backdrop to what we're talking about today. It was early in the ministry of Jesus, and He has just spent an entire day preaching. He preached 4 sermons, all back to back. And the location where He was preaching was at a place called the Sea of Galilee. There were so many people who gathered around to hear His preaching that He actually borrowed a boat from some local fishermen, pushed out several yards from the shore so He could preach to the entire audience and have everyone hear Him. Well, He wrapped up His 4th sermon. It's time to call it a day and go home. The band played the closing song, so we're going to pick it up there at the end of His church service. Here's what happened in Mark chapter 4, verse 35. That day when evening came, He said to His disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took Him along, just as He was in the boat. There were also other boats with Him. Now, but before we move the story along, I want to draw your attention to something that I think is incredibly important here. Both in these opening verses and throughout this story, Mark, who wrote this down, includes a number of details that have nothing to do with anything. Did you see what some of them were? For example, it's evening. Great. What does that have to do with the story? Nothing. Does not impact the story whatsoever. It says they took Jesus just as He was. What does that mean? Well, He was in the boat preaching, and instead of going back to shore to get His things, they just sailed across the other side of the lake. What does that have to do with anything? Nothing. Doesn't advance the story at all. It's just there. He says that there were other boats there with Him. Do you know what role the other boats play in this story? None. They're not mentioned again. It's just there were some other boats there, just in case you're wondering. In a couple verses, we'll discover that Jesus fell asleep on the boat. And just so you know, He wasn't sleeping on His cloak. He wasn't sleeping on a robe. He was sleeping on a cushion, in case you're wondering what He slept on when He was in a boat. And in case you're wondering where He fell asleep, He was in the stern, which for us landlubbers is in the back of the boat, not in the front, not in the middle. He was in the back of the boat. The question is, why does Mark include all of these details that have nothing to do with the story, and they do not advance the plot line whatsoever? Here's why this is important. Historians who are not Christians will tell you that they would like to dismiss this and other narratives from Mark's gospel and other gospels as being fiction. In other words, their real history, we know there was a guy named Jesus. He obviously had a history, but these stories couldn't have happened the way they're recorded for us because they include the supernatural, they include the miraculous, therefore we know they couldn't happen. The problem is, non-Christian historians will tell you that they cannot honestly, intellectually dismiss these stories. And there's 2 very important reasons why. The first reason has to do with all these insignificant details. The insignificant details are incredibly significant in this story. Why would you include details in a story that do not advance the plot line if you made up the story? Why would you include unnecessary details in a story that don't have meaning, don't have significance, and don't help us understand the point? The only reason you would include those is if someone remembered them. And out of someone's memory, he's just telling and explaining what happened on that day. You say, oh, no, that's not true. When we write fiction, we include all kinds of little details to make it seem more real. Yes, we do today. That is not how they wrote fiction in the ancient world. In the ancient world, fiction accounts were exaggerated, legend-like, larger-than-life stories that were not intended to reflect actual reality or make the reader believe that they actually happened. They were written in a literary style that showed that they were legend, that they were fiction stories. And here's what's interesting. No one in the ancient world wrote fiction like this. And when I say no one, I mean no one, which means one of two things. Either Mark is writing a story that actually took place, and these are the details that were remembered from that story, or Mark, as the first human being in history, pioneered a brand new literary style that no one repeated after him for 18 centuries. No one wrote that way before, no one wrote that way after him for 18 centuries, and this one man alone in history pioneered his own writing style, or he's telling us what actually happened. See, today, most reasonable Americans and people who are agnostic and not sure about the whole God thing would say, I know there was a Jesus, we just can't really know him because the church made up these stories after the fact, and we'll never really know who the real Jesus was. There's a problem with that. That's not being honest. Mark was written about 25 years after Jesus died and rose, which means that the eyewitnesses, both those who loved and those who hated Jesus, were still around to read Mark's account of the life of Jesus. Which means that if Mark was making up legend, if Mark was trying to build up the persona of Jesus into a larger-than-life character, he would have been exposed as a fraud in his own generation by the people who were all there, which is why even non-Christian historians cannot simply dismiss this as being fiction. The insignificant details and the reality of the context are too important. Okay, that's very interesting, Jason. Why are you going to such great lengths? The reason why is simple. I'm going to make the argument today that it is Jesus himself who allows you to confront and deal with and terminate the worry in your life. But if this didn't happen, then the only power that Jesus has for you is inspirational and motivational power. We see the story and, oh, that moves me, oh, that inspires me, oh, that motivates me to deal with the worry in my life. I would submit to you that that's not actual power. That's just motivation, and motivation wears off. But if what we're going to read today actually happened in history, what that means is that Jesus Christ has real-world power. He has real-world power over the world that we live in, over the nature that we live in, over our lives, and over the reality of the human existence. And that very real-world power, which is at work today, is the thing that gives us power to deal with the worry in our lives. Whether or not this happened in history makes all the difference in the world when it comes to tapping into the power that Jesus has and offers to us to deal with the worry in our lives. That's why it's important to know that this actually happened, because that reframes how we deal with worry. All right, let's get back to the story. Verse 37. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. Now, the Sea of Galilee, where this took place, is 700 feet below sea level. 30 miles to the north is Mount Hermon, which is 9,200 feet above sea level, which means that when the hot air rising from the sea and then the cold air coming down from the mountains clash, the area is known for some very violent storms, even to this very day. Well, this must have been one exceptional, incredible storm that it had this kind of impact on the disciples. Several of the disciples were professional fishermen, and they fished this very place where the storm was. And as the storm came up, they were bailing water, and the problem was the boat was nearly swamped. They couldn't bail water fast enough in order to keep the boat floating. In other words, they got into a situation where there's not much they could do. What are the disciples going to do when there's not much they can do? The answer is they're going to worry. We're going to die. Look at what happened. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher," this is interesting, "don't you care? Jesus, don't you care about us? We're worried over here. We're afraid over here. We don't think you care. Don't you care if we drown. Professional fishermen, nothing they could do, they start to panic. They're afraid, they start to worry. And in their fear, in their worry, they accuse Jesus of not caring because he's asleep on a cushion. By the way, I'll just say this for Jesus. After you preach all day, you can fall asleep anywhere. It's amazing. But they accuse him of not caring. How is Jesus going to respond to this accusation? Look what happens. He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. Now, there's two amazing things that we see here. Number one is this. When Jesus got up, he did not pull out a magic wand. He did not call on a higher power. He did not begin incantations, which is significant because as you read ancient literature that tells fables of miraculous things, they always called on the higher power and did incantations and all these magical things to get the god or the gods or whomever to act on their behalf. He does not call on anyone, but he gets up from his nap, looks at the storm, and says, literally, "Be quiet and stay quiet." The way a parent would address a naughty, unruly child who's running around screaming and wakes them up from their nap, the parent comes out of the room on Sunday afternoon and says, "Be quiet and stay quiet." That's the first amazing thing that happens. You know what the second amazing thing is? It obeyed. You can't even get your kid to do that from your nap. The wind and the waves obey him. And this seems redundant, but it isn't. It says, Mark tells us, the wind died down and it was completely calm. Now, the word completely calm, it's a funny Greek word. Literally translated, it means mega calm. You know, we just don't talk that way, but it means mega calm. He's talking about two different things. It's not redundant. First of all, the wind that was howling stops. To which anyone could say, well, maybe that was a coincidence. Maybe the high-pressure system moved out of the region, and it happened to move out of the region right as Jesus woke up from his nap, and he said, "Be quiet," and the wind calmed down. But not the second part. It became completely calm is referring to the waves. Because even if you're on the sea and the wind is rocking and the waves are going like that, if the wind stops, the waves are still going to go for hours. But what Mark is telling us here is all the waves of the sea instantly became like glass. You know how it is on some mornings when you wake up and you see at the lake and there's just no wind at all and it is like glass. That's what happened to the sea when Jesus said, "Be quiet and stay quiet," to a hurricane blowing. It listened to him like a child. Now, this is interesting in context because in ancient cultures, something that all ancient religions had in common, and this might be the only thing they had in common, is that they all agreed that the sea is an untamable force, and only God or the gods or the spirits have power over the sea. In fact, there's an interesting piece of literature about 200 years before Mark wrote his biography of the life of Jesus, telling about an evil dictator from Syria at that time. His name was Antiochus Epiphanes. He was just a maniacal man. He claimed that he had power over the seas, and immediately religious leaders from around that area, and especially from Israel, the rabbis, said, "That's not just overreaching. That isn't just self-aggrandizement. That's heresy. That's blasphemy. Everybody knows only God has power over the seas. Only God has power over the oceans." The message that Jesus is sending here is very powerful in any generation, but especially in the ancient world, because he says to a hurricane, "Sit down and shut up," and it listens to him like an unruly child. It hears the voice of the one who called them into existence. It hears the voice of the author of all life. And before that voice, they humble themselves and bow incredibly low when he commands them to be still. You know what that means about Jesus? It means that Jesus does not simply have power. It means that Jesus is power itself. If he has power over the seas, It means he is power itself. Last week we saw how Jesus does not just provide rest, he does not just offer rest, he is rest itself. Today we see he does not just have power and he does not just offer power, he is power itself. And all power that exists and all power that we know, whether it's human power, whether it's the power of nature, it is all subservient and it is all on loan to Jesus himself, who is power, who looks at the storm and he says to it, "Quiet, be still." That's an amazing claim that Jesus makes. And I'll talk in a minute about the implications. First, before we get there, Jesus has to bring it full circle and talk to his disciples. So he wakes up from his nap, the disciples wake him up, he rebukes the storm, it says, "Yes, sir," gets real calm, and now his disciples are still there. Now, we can empathize with the disciples, I think, that we can imagine what it'd be like to be in a boat in a huge storm and you're afraid you're going to drown. So look at how he comforts his disciples with the next verse. He said to his disciples, "I'm so sorry that I let you get into a situation where you were worried. Let's go to shore and make some hot cocoa." I made that up. That is not in the Bible. I just wanted to see who read their Bibles this morning. Here's what Jesus actually said to the disciples. Here's the real Mark 4:40. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid?" Why are you so afraid? Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? See, we're hoping that Jesus would say something more like the first verse where, "Oh, I'm so sorry," because isn't it true when you are worried about something? Isn't it true when life has gotten to a place where you can no longer control the outcomes? When you are in a situation where there's not much more you can do, don't you want more than anything, if there is a God, for God to show up and say, "Oh, there, it's okay, don't worry, I'll make it all better. Here, I put some marshmallows in the cocoa, here you go." That's what we want, but that is not what the disciples get when they were worried about dying. He says, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still, after all this, have no faith?" Now, in this rebuke from Jesus, we discover something very important. We discover what causes worry in our lives. Here's why the disciples were so worried. The disciples experienced disordered anxiety. They did not have an anxiety disorder, but they experienced a disordered anxiety. What do I mean by that? Worry in your life always has an invisible string tied to another part of your life. And on the other end of that invisible string is whatever it is you are devoted to in your heart. You worry about things that you are devoted to. You do not worry about things you are not devoted to. Let me give you some examples. I do not worry about your job. I don't know if that makes me a bad pastor, but it is the truth. Now, if you tell me something about your job or you're unemployed, I will pray with you. I will be concerned about it. I will care for you, but I'm not worried about your job. Do you know why? The reason I'm not worried is because I'm not devoted to your job. I am not worried about your kids' grades. I'm not. If you ask me, hey, my kid's not doing so well, I will pray with you, I'll be concerned with you, but I'm not worried about it. Do you know why? I'm not devoted to your kids' academic performance in school. I do not worry, I have never once worried about your retirement. I hope it's great, I hope it's nice, hope you have a great time, whatever you like to do. If you like to go on a cruise, hope you can do it. If you like to go fishing, hope you can do it. Hope you have a lot of whatever it is you do, but I'm not worried about your retirement. And the reason why I'm not worried is because I'm not devoted to your retirement. But if you talk about those things in my life, I might start to have some worries because those might be some things I'm devoted to in my life. The point is, you worry about whatever it is that you are devoted to. And the reason why Jesus rebuked them is because he knew something about their worry. There was something they were devoted to that was leading to this incredible worry they had. Well, what were they devoted to? Security? Safety? comfort, an easy life. And when all that was taken away, when all of that was threatened, when what they were devoted to was threatened, they began to worry. And Jesus rebuked them. How can you worry? Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? Now, this picture goes to our hearts because everyone who's ever tried to live a life of faith, we get there sometimes, don't we? We're just overcome by worry where everything's wrong and it feels like we're sinking and God seems to be asleep or he seems to be absent or he seems to be unaware and we're afraid we're going to drown. We're afraid the storm is going to come over us. And we say, God, if you were more attentive, this wouldn't be happening to us. God, we're so worried this isn't going to end well. God, I'm afraid that, I'm afraid that, I'm afraid that. Jesus comes in and says, why are you so afraid? What is it in your thinking that has made you think that this storm you're going through is somehow incompatible with my love for you? This storm and my love are not incompatible things. In fact, many times they go together. This trial, this thing that is threatening whatever it is you're devoted to, and my love and my power over the situation, those are not incompatible things. They often go hand in hand with one another. I do allow people I love to go through storms in life. But even as they go through storms, what are you afraid of? Where's your faith? Do you still have no faith? Do you still have no confidence in Jesus? Well, the reaction from the disciples is pretty fascinating, I think, with what comes next. Because when they were on the boat in the storm, they were afraid and they were worried. That was their emotional state. Jesus quiets the storm, becomes like glass. And note their emotional state now. Look at what happens emotionally. Now, they were what? Storm's gone. Now they're terrified. Why are they terrified now? They were terrified and asked each other, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. See, the storm didn't go out, it just moved from the sea into their hearts. Because while they were facing the unmanageable power of nature, they see that Jesus has greater power than nature, but unfortunately, he's even more unmanageable than the sea is. He doesn't do what I want him to do. He doesn't act the way I think he should act. I see this great power of the storm. Now I see a greater power in Jesus. I see the unmanageable power of the storm, but now I see that Jesus is even more unmanageable. He's more unruly than the storm is. He does what I want even less than the storm does. But those are all your two alternatives in life. You realize that, right? You can live worried about the storm, or you can live worried about Jesus. You can live worried about being overcome by nature, or you can live worried about missing out on Jesus. Now, if you're worried about nature, guess what? Nature's going to win. Okay, if it's not a storm or a fire or a disaster that kills you, give it time. Nature will beat you. Everyone you've ever known, nature beat them, or it is beating them. We get older, we get more tired, and eventually we end in the grave. So if you want to entrust yourself to the fact that, hey, maybe we're all here by accident, maybe it's all random, maybe it's all a chance, maybe there is a big bang, and maybe life generated, what that means is this. It means that pretty soon nature will beat you and you will die, and pretty soon the sun's going to explode and all humanity's going to die, and then nothing mattered. Doesn't matter if you were good, doesn't matter if you were bad, doesn't matter if you loved people, doesn't matter if you hated people. Nothing matters because there's no one left to remember anything that ever happened. Nothing mattered. That's what happens when you entrust yourself and worry about nature. But if Jesus has power over nature, that means that life now has meaning. Because when you die, there's still someone you answer to. There is someone who is in power above nature, enthroned above nature, the one who called nature into being, and that is Jesus. But there's a difference between the storms of life and nature and Jesus. And you know what the difference is? The storms don't love you. The storms don't care about you. Nature doesn't love you. It didn't call you into being. It does not give itself up for you in love. Jesus came to this earth to love you. Jesus, who has all power over all of nature, entered this world to forgive you. That's the difference that we see. There are huge, huge difference. If Jesus is God and he did this for you, nature's indifferent to you, but Jesus actually loves you. So he says to his disciples, where is your faith? Do you still have no faith? Don't you see that you have me? And I'm more powerful than the storm, and I have love for you. And that's the first thing we learn today as we wrap up. If you know Jesus loves you, you can be calm in a storm. If you know Jesus loves you, you can be calm in a storm, because although his power is unmanageable, he at least loves you. You say, Jason, I do not see the love of Jesus anywhere in this story. I see tired, crotchety Jesus is all I see, rebuking the storm, rebuking the disciples. How can you say Jesus loves me? Actually, it's very clear when you step back and see the whole account. Mark has deliberately written this account. He has deliberately structured his story in a way that parallels another story from the Old Testament. The account of Jesus calming the storm in Mark chapter 4 perfectly parallels Jonah in the storm in Jonah chapter 1. Think about this. Both Jonah and Jesus get into a boat, and the boat is overtaken by a storm. The sailors in each of the boats do everything they can to stay afloat, but ultimately they realize they're going to drown. The sailors go to the part of the boat where they find Jesus and Jonah asleep on the boat in the storm, and they wake them up and say, "We're all going to die. Can you do something about it?" And in both of the stories, after they woke up, the sea became calm, like glass. And in both accounts, the sailors were more terrified after the storm was calmed than they were during the storm. You say, but there's one difference. In the account of Jonah, Jonah said, "Throw me into the ocean and the storm will be calmed." Where Jesus just simply got up and rebuked the storm and said, "Quiet, be still," and it became like glass. So maybe they're not the same story after all. Actually, if you read the entire biography of Mark, you will find that they are the same story. Take a step back and look at the big picture of the life of Jesus. In Matthew chapter 12, Jesus said that someone greater than Jonah is here. In other words, what Jonah did was something that foreshadows what I am here to do. When Jonah was awakened, he willingly said to the sailors, "This is my fault. If you throw me into the sea, the storm will become. If you throw me in, God's wrath will be satisfied and you will all be saved. Throw me in and kill me, and I will be saved." Jesus Christ on the cross said, "I am willingly throwing myself into the ocean of God's wrath. I am throwing myself under the ocean of God's judgment, the judgment I deserve and you deserve for our sins. God's wrath, his storm of wrath that is bearing down on us to overtake us." Jesus said, "I will suffer for you. I will enter God's wrath for you, and I will satisfy God's wrath so that the only storm that can truly sink you, the storm of God's judgment, the storm of God's wrath, Jesus threw himself into it so that the storm of God's wrath over sin has been silenced because it has been satisfied through the life and death of the Son of God, Jesus Christ. And if Jesus was willing to quiet the ultimate storm for you and for me, if he quieted the only storm that can hurt you, the storm of God's wrath, can we not trust him in the much smaller storms that we sail through in life? If we are devoted to the love and the beauty and the majesty of Jesus who did this for us, then the other things we're devoted to, they don't matter quite as much. They're not as big of a deal, and our worry about those things goes down. So that's our second big idea that we see here from Mark today. Jesus suffered the storm of God's wrath for you. That's how you become calm in your storms. To look at Jesus. So, today, at the beginning of this message, and I was talking about being in situations where there's not much you can do, what were you worried about? For some of you, you thought about your health or the health of someone you love. For some of you, you thought about your kids. For some of you, you thought about your future. For some of you, you thought about your finances. What are you worried about? This week, I'm going to challenge you to take some time, to make some time, and figure out what is it that I am devoted to? What is it I am devoted to that is being threatened or taken away from me that is causing me to worry? And if I know Jesus suffered the ultimate storm of God's wrath for me, how does that teach me to look at this storm I'm going through right now? Now, if you want to do some extra credit, I'm also going to challenge you to read Mark chapters 4 and 5 for next Sunday, because we're going to pick it up in Mark chapter 5 next week, because we're just getting started with learning how to live with no worries. Let me pray for you. Father in heaven, thank you. Thank you that Mark so meticulously recorded this account for us so that we could know that Jesus has power in our very real world. He is the Lord of nature. He is power itself. Jesus, forgive us for worrying and panicking when you've already taken care of the only thing that matters, and that is our eternity with God. Through you, God welcomes us, loves us, accepts us, because you were sacrificed for our sins willingly on the cross. Jesus, thank you for your grace in our lives. Now, what I ask for everyone listening today is that you yourself would give us wisdom to apply this truth to our lives, to apply this truth to the place where we struggle with worry. For the man or woman listening who's been stuck in chronic worry in one area of their life, Jesus, I ask that you would free them, that you would liberate them from worry so that they could see that you are the God who is more powerful than what is threatening them, but you are the God who loves them so much. You gave them a home in heaven. Please bless us for the rest of this series so that we can confront all the worries in our lives. We ask this in your name, Jesus.